This is the Vanguard Podcast. I'm Gavin.
And I'm Zac.
And we're so pleased to welcome to the show today Maximillian Alvarez, editor-in-chief at the Real News Network and the host of the Working People Podcast. How's it going today, Maximillian?
It's going all right, guys. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're excited to chat today.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, Maximillian. And as I mentioned, you're the host of the Working People Podcast, which Zac and I are both huge fans of over here at the Vanguard. We think the kind of work you're doing over there is great. And I just wanted to ask you how you decided to get started with that and what inspired you to just start a platform where you essentially just talk to and platform the voices of real working people.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I'm really glad that you guys are liking the show. You know, as you well know, right? You know, we don't do this for the money. that's for sure. So you know, like there's always like a labor of love aspect to it. And you know, I knew that kind of going in, and I feel very, very fortunate that you know I stumbled upon the type of show that you know I can never love too much, right? You know, and talking to the kind of people who I can never love too much. So I guess like that would be like one of my main pieces of advice for anyone who's thinking of starting a show is make sure you can love it, right? Make sure that it, you know, that love can withstand all of the kind of pitfalls and agonies and injustices of building a media product in the 20th century. And you know, it was very much it grew out of a place of love as well. You know, I've told this story on a couple of other shows, you know, kind of about the origin story of working people. You know, my folks, they both come from, you know, family backgrounds, you know, steeped in poverty, steeped in struggle. You know, my dad was born in Tijuana with 3 siblings, and their father abandoned them, and my grandma Josefina, passed away when my dad was just 6 years old. So you know, then they kind of went through a really trying process where they were essentially split up and brought over to the United States. Kind of they found families to live with that through the church. And this is actually, you know, I talk about this because it's part of like the kind of original catalog, right? Like the very first episode I ever did of Working People was with my dad, Jesus Alvarez. And we actually did a follow-up to that in season 2, where, you know, because of the success of that first episode, I think to this day it's still the most listened to episode, which I'm very proud of because I love my dad and I love that he, you know, took that brave step to be my guinea pig when I wanted to do that first episode. But you know, that episode had actually brought me and my dad closer together, and I think it had brought our family a little closer together. And I'll get back to that in a second, why that was. But in the second season, you know, knowing that I had interviewed my dad about his life and his kind of path to where he is now, you know, I thought it would be cool. One year when I went home for the holidays, I brought my recorder with me because we always go to my tia Tere's house, and I knew that all my tios were going to be there. And so after everyone had a couple beers, a lot of tacos and stuff like that, after the Lakers were on and things were kind of dying down a little bit, I just like set up the recorder and asked if like they would want to kind of do a follow up and have the siblings kind of fill in their sides of the story. And I think that episode is called Mi Familia, if anyone wants to go back and listen to that. And, you know, it was a really great episode. It's one of my absolute favorites for obvious reasons. But there was a moment in that episode when, you know, my dad and my tios were talking about when my grandma Josefina died. And unprompted, like, you know, and unexpected, they all just kind of started crying. And I think we all did for like a good, you know, 30 seconds. And it was a very, I think, you know, beautiful, powerful, and cathartic moment for us. And, you know, on the ride home, I was talking to my dad about it. And he said, you know, I think he's like, that's the first time all 4 of us have sat down and talked about our mom dying. And I was like, you guys have been in each other's lives for like over 60 years. And this is the first time you've ever talked about that together. And I was like, I didn't know that, but I was really proud and honored that like something that seemed so insignificant as recording a podcast episode ended up being so significant for us and our family. And it just, I go into that story because it just constantly reminds me of the power of giving people a chance to tell their stories, right? It just reminds me of how seldom we give ourselves or one another that gift, because it is a gift, right? And there's a lot of, one of the pillars of working people is that there's real political power in doing that, right? There is a real essential political component to offering that gift to one another, to listening to one another, to reminding ourselves and each other that, our lives and our stories matter, and that we're not the kind of insignificant, soulless beings that capitalism tells us every day that we are.
Yeah, I
Right?
think
We're
that's
not
so
the bear. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so
Go for it.
important. And the best part, one of the highlights of your podcast is because we are so very intentionally by the capitalist media model that we have, the perspective and the experiences of working people and the pain and the love and the range of emotions that are felt by, the majority of Americans who are working people are completely erased from the media that we're exposing ourselves to. And if you look at it, this, it was never great. There was never great working class representation in media, but over the past couple of decades, it's become even worse and worse. And there's almost no representation of, working class experience and working class lives. And one of the things that I think is so, powerful about your show and your platform is that, you don't need the capitalist media system to, create those stories for us. We can share our own real stories, and they're more powerful than they would be if they, had been, kind of come up and concocted by, some studio executive. And I'm wondering how we can take that very real energy, that the emotion, that connection that you feel to people when you hear them open up and share their truthful experiences. How do we turn that into political power, like you were talking about? It seems like with the Democratic Party, it's almost been moving more towards the PMC, erasing the working class entirely. So how do we resist that, and how do we take this energy that's so clearly present and move forward with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think it's the essential question, right? And I think it's one of those things that, in one sense, like, it's kind of like you need to let it go where it wants to, right? Because I think the way that I would start answering that question is that, as I was saying, there is a power there. There is a kinetic force. It's just never been truly unleashed in this country. And so I think that as much as we should and can kind of think about how we could channel that power into what ends, it's also essential to kind of recognize that, as the power of the literal power of the people, the power of people realizing that they are human and that they deserve better than this, right? That we all deserve better than this. When human beings when a community of human beings like recognizes that fact, they're capable of anything. And we've seen this throughout history. And I think that you're absolutely right that the mainstream media has been a really vital kind of organ of capitalist hegemony that essentially absorbs that energy and converts it into nothing, right? Or converts it into commercialism, converts it into something that allows people to feel like they are maybe expressing that power without allowing that power to actually express itself, like in any sort of way that would challenge the existing power structure. And so I guess that's my kind of preface to my real answer to that question, is that we don't know, what could be unleashed if we actually did work harder together collectively. It has to be a collective project to de-alienate ourselves and our fellow workers, and to revivify those types of human connections that remind us how much we need one another and how much we all depend on one another and the world that we share, how much we are all kind of responsible for stewarding that world, forward. And, I think that one podcast is obviously not going to like change the world, but it's more about like the tradition that I see myself kind of participating in, right? This is something that organizers do every day, right? Is you listen, right? Any organizer will tell you that the most important job an organizer will do is listen to people. I had I just did an episode with a social worker in the Bronx, Michelle Manco, who's a really brilliant woman, and she said that social workers need to ask what people want and stop asking what the system wants of them. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And I think that, that's kind of where my answer would lie, right? Is like, you see those tweets from Bernie Sanders and other people being like, what would you do if your debt was erased? Right. And I think that those types of questions are really essential because they invite people to think about how their humanity would express itself if we weren't so shackled by the wage relations, right? By the kind of commodity fetishism of living in this fucking capitalist hellscape, right? If we were actually allowed to live and be the sorts of beings that we were meant to, if you once you start seeing that as not only like a a thought exercise, but actually a real possibility, that I think is kind of what drives real political change. That's what drives revolutions, right? And so, where I think this type of communication, this grassroots, non-commodified type of communication, by which I mean, communication that doesn't have an ask attached to it, right? Communication for communication's sake, for connection's sake, right? Really just, affirming for one another that your story is enough. You are enough. You deserve to be heard, right? Like your humanity deserves to be celebrated because it is your humanity, right? Not for any other reason, right? I mean, doing that work and convincing ourselves and one another of that type of stuff, right, is vital to building the type of solidarity that we're going to need to take on the massive and nefarious forces that we are combating, right? I mean, that's been kind of the $1 million question for the left, forever, but in this country, especially. And like, how do you have a country where wealth disparity is so incredible, power is so concentrated in the hands of so few, and so many are so routinely fucked over so often? How do you get those people to really kind of work together to overthrow the former, right? And kind of build the sort of world that they deserve? We see this every day. We see it through the media. We see it through social media. We see all the different ways that people are divided, right? That people are divided from each other and even alienated from themselves. People tell themselves they don't deserve a better life. They punish themselves for not being able to pay for their rent when, the very foundation of that rent system is unjust, right? I mean, like, this is exactly why I wanted to give my dad that opportunity to talk in the first episode, because for years after we lost our house in the Great Recession, I could see how much he was punishing himself. He was self-flagellating within himself, within his brain, within his soul for years, and it was killing him. Like, he was not the man that I knew growing up. And, the moment that he started talking to like the people he was driving in Uber and realizing that he wasn't alone, the moment that, he started talking to me and really kind of feeling like his experiences were valid and that it wasn't all his fault, the more willing he was to embrace other people in that position, to really think about himself as part of a collective, not just this kind of atomized agent who had failed in a system that set him up to fail. Right. I think that type of solidarity building is necessary for whatever political project we develop. And it's the glue that's going to hold the whole thing together. It's what's going to keep people attached to one another, and attached to the struggle when everything else is going to be trying to push us apart.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about as far as solidarity in the digital age goes, I think that that thinking is very innovative and very necessary, especially moving forward. And you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and who, of course, I think was one of the people trying to kind of create a more equitable world that's not so, capitalistic in nature, or at least not as many victims of the system of inequality, which has been so perpetuated. And that, of course, brings to mind the way the media treated Bernie Sanders. Of course, there was the infamous Bernie blackout that was talked about widely in lefty circles, although obviously not in the mainstream media, hence the title or name. And we talk to a lot of candidates here at the Vanguard that are, funded through grassroots means, small dollar donations. They're not reliant on the corporate machine or the lobbyist industries, which so many politicians in DC are. And usually they say that pretty much, if not the biggest, but one of the biggest obstacles that they consistently face is the mainstream media, whether it's because they're not being covered equitably, or they're not being covered fairly, or they're the victim of smear campaigns. We've seen this over and over again. And concurrently to this, we see on the right wing this very scary phenomenon where lots of right wingers are kind of leaving any and all sense of reality. They're leaving even Fox News because that's too based in reality for them. It's not affirming their ridiculous notions and these conspiracy theories that have been sowed by the likes of Sidney Powell and Rudy Giuliani about the election and these claims of fraud, which haven't really come to fruition. So, it's this interesting place where on the left, you don't ever want to fall into that kind of a thing where you just lose touch with reality and, stop paying attention to any, quote unquote, authoritative sources, any mainstream media outlets, because a lot of, good reporting is subsidized by, the New York Times or CNN, or at least it was at one point. And regardless of their, opinion editorials and that kind of stuff, journalism has to be funded through somewhere. And, as much as we love the Patreon and Substack model, I think that we would agree that the funding has to come for, some big budget journalism from somewhere. And I just wanted to get your perspective on what the left should do as a movement, or I guess at least on an individual level as a, consumer of news and media, how we can kind of consciously combat this supremacy of the corporate mainstream media while also supporting great journalism and making sure that that tradition doesn't die off.
That's a great question. Let's tell you what, if you figured out, you let me know. I mean, no, I think like this is exactly where our heads need to be at, and I guess there are a couple of things that I would say, because I think the more people we have thinking about this question, the better, right? And I don't just say that out of a self-interested, nerdy place because my degrees were in media studies and history, media history and stuff. So in one sense, I need that to be true in order to justify all that fucking time that I spent, reading these books. But in another, reading about the history of the changing media landscape in the US and in Mexico, even in parts of Europe, right? It was all very enlightening to me because I see media and politics as fundamentally intertwined in any historical epoch, right? I mean, again, if politics is fundamentally a team sport, if it is fundamentally a mass sport, right, then you need the actual media, going all the way back to the Latin roots, media being the things that connect us, the things that connect that which is separated, right? Media are the kind of relations and tendrils that bind us to one another, that communicate information to one another, right? We ourselves are being mediums right now, bringing our audiences in conversation with one another. And we're communicating through technology that, conveys the thoughts in our head through the language that's coming out of our mouths, yada, yada, yada. Media is everywhere, right? My whole dissertation was premised on the notion that media are the connective tissue of being, that we cannot be who we are without being connected to our other people and to the world that we're a part of. And media, that we are who we are, always in conversation with the world, and media are the facilitators of that conversation, right? That's what I spent 400 fucking pages writing. That's basically it, right? So in order to kind of make that less abstract, right, in every historical epoch, right, the question of how we communicate our political program, how we reach people, how we get them on our side, how we gain intel about what struggles they're facing, what the power structures of their worlds are, where they come from, where they're vulnerable, right? All of that. And not just that, but also how we, move through time and space, how we preserve traditions, whether in songs or oral traditions or literature, history, right? That is the past communicating to us in ways that are politically necessary. Otherwise, we're always going to be reinventing the wheel, right? We are always part of an ongoing political struggle that stretches back to the beginning of time, right? And so, that includes methods of transportation, right? It includes methods of communication and preservation of memory and, all that good stuff.
It kind of reminds me
so,
a little bit about the work that, and maybe if I'm off base a little bit here, but there's this book, Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, came out in the 80s. And he kind of went on this idea about like when the medium actually that you're using to convey these political idea changes. So he was commenting on it with, changing largely from print to television, that the way that people were receiving these ideas is now changed because the communication method is different. And so what sticks and what people, are able to, receive at a greater level changes. Do you think that's going to be evidenced again in the changes that we see with the internet?
Yes, I do. So I think, let's see, because I think, bringing up Neil Postman is great. And I'm trying to make sure that I can like tie that back to what I was just saying, because I think they're fundamentally connected. Because, essentially what I was getting at, right, with that whole spiel on media, right, a more elemental understanding of media, is that what we call the mainstream media, right, are these outsized pillars of that kind of media ecology, to use Neil Postman's term, that we're all a part of, right? So like a lot of the connections that could be made between us, right, a lot of the things that could be informing us in our politics and how we relate to one another are channeled through mainstream media, right? And that infrastructure has been set up over centuries, which is what Neil Postman talks about. I actually kind of cite that same book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in a piece that I wrote for the Baffler a couple of years ago called the Real World Trump Edition. But I tried to basically explain how to understand how we got to Trump, you need to go all the way back to the Telegraph, right? Because, and I apologize for listeners because this is going to be a very Spark Notes version of what I talk about there, right? But Postman identifies the Telegraph as a kind of tectonic shift in media history, right? Because until that point, you think about the function of the free press, you think about the function of local news. It wasn't called that at the time, but that's what it was. News was fundamentally local because it was a medium that was established in a local community that was limited by the bounds of physics and by the technology of the day, right? So if you were going to be reporting on or commenting on, relevant information, if you were going to make your newspaper in, the colonies or whatever the fuck survive, right, you needed information that people in your immediate sphere could recognize and in fact could use, right? You were handing information that you were conveying information through this medium that, again, like it was part of their being. It allowed them to live in a certain way. It allowed them to live more effectively in their worlds and to know what was going on with agriculture, with business, with culture, with politics, and to then kind of act in the world as a more kind of informed citizen, right? With the parentheses that like that was white landowning males at the time. With the telegraph and with the train system, we broke those kinds of barriers. We were now suddenly able to convey information through time and space at a hitherto unprecedented pace, right? And so what that meant for newspapers and the news industry was that the information that made it onto their pages was not just kind of limited to what the people making those newspapers could source in their local communities. It was coming through the telegraph, right? And so now you had an ever enlarging, like the increasing amount of information that has come through those wires has never gotten like smaller. It has only gotten bigger since then, right? And so the amount of information that keeps coming in forces an evolution in the news industry where suddenly people who have newspapers or, little independent publications, right? And if they had access to, those telegraph communicators, because at a time, a lot of those were really monopolized by certain companies. It was only in the 20th century that they started to become a bit more democratically accessible in the US and abroad. But anyway, as it becomes more accessible, as more papers and more outlets get access to that information that's coming from beyond their local spheres, and I say this as an editor now, you have to then make decisions about what to put on the finite amount of paper for this week's issue, right? And so then what influences that calculus? What influences the decisions you're making about what to keep and what to cut and how to present it? That is where the capitalist kind of like underpinnings of the American media system really start to show themselves, right? That is where the penny press really kind of emerged as a dominant cultural force in the late 19th century and early 20th century, right? Because if you sell papers at a lower cost, if you're not supplementing the cost of your papers through advertisements, then what you're really banking on is selling a shit ton of copies. And how you do that is by selling what sells, right? Blood, right? Like the if it bleeds, it leads, right? I mean, so you get, a news system that gets hooked and addicted to the shallow and the sensational, right? And in many ways, we haven't outgrown that, right? In many ways, we're kind of in that ecosphere, that ecosystem on hyperdrive, right? Because now we are consuming more information than ever at a quicker pace than ever. And we're consuming it in like smaller and smaller bits through tweets, through headlines, through whatever we hear in podcasts and manage to retain. This is what Neil Postman calls the problem of information glut, right? And I think the reason I go into that in detail, and I apologize, you guys hit a nerve here. The reason I think it's so important to understand why information glut is a concept worth understanding is because Postman, more than anyone else at the time, saw that had political ramifications, because he said that if you are a consumer of media, right, and every day you are getting more and more information from the world beyond your local sphere, from news from outside of the country, news from other states, news now today about the environment, about wars in other lands, about this world that we seem to be like only watching through 3D glasses while it's on fire. The thing that he points out is that throws off the information action ratio. He says, when you have a glut of information, you have a poverty of action, because you can't do much with all that information except consume it and move on to the next, thing, because the information is always coming and we just keep getting fatter and fatter on these tidbits of information. But then we lose the very purpose of what a free press was meant to be. Right? It's not just to keep us informed about what's going on. Like I said earlier, it's about giving us information that we can act on, that can make us better democratic actors and stewards of democracy itself. We don't have that now. We have been forced into the position, and mainstream media has accelerated this for over a century. It has put us in the position of the constant position of consumers, not as democratic, engaged actors in the world that we're a part of, but really just spectators to a world that is fed to us through these media. Sorry, I'll shut up for a second.
Oh, that was
a great answer. Thank you. Do you have something you wanted to follow up with, Zach?
Oh, no, you can go ahead, Gavin.
Okay, well, yeah, as a next kind of question and follow-up to that, I was just wondering, because you mentioned that you yourself are an editor, obviously, at the Real News. And one of the more, I guess, interesting episodes, and something that I still feel, to be honest, slightly conflicted about, that happened recently was when Glenn Greenwald left The Intercept over, editorial issues, and he didn't like the fact that they were imposing a little bit more editorial oversight on his work than he was used to. And I just want to get your opinion on all that as an editor yourself, and what you think about the Substack or Patreon model of journalism that I mentioned earlier. Do you think it has the potential to kind of liberate journalists from the increasingly corporate grip that they have on editorial boards and in the high echelons of newspapers like the New York Times, or do you think it's kind of sacrificing some of what makes journalism a collaborative effort in the first place?
Yes. So I think a little bit of all of it, honestly. I think that, let's see where to start. Right. I mean, I guess I would say to start, right, if people haven't, they should at least check out, for reference's sake, John Nichols and Rob McChesney's book, The Life and Death of American Journalism. I think it gives a good sketch of the changes in the industry over the past, I think it was written like 10, 12 years ago. So the first part of the 21st century. And it gives a lot of good context for the 20th century as well. But, I think that they kind of draw what is essentially the same conclusion that I would draw, which is that even when it was at its most, efficient, right? The advertising revenue based model that mainstream media had pegged itself to, that the news industry had staked its very existence on for like 2 centuries, right? Was never a good model, right? It was never a model
William Randolph Hearst monopoly model.
Yeah. It was a terrible model. Because it essentially staked what is a vital democratic function, a function that is needed for a democracy to work, if you believe that in a democracy, it is the people who rule, right? Obviously, we're not in that situation now, but even if you go back to the quote unquote founding fathers, this is what they really wanted in the free press, right? Was something that, could provide, an external source of information and accountability, that would give, democratic actors the ability to hold their government accountable, to make decisions, yada, 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 right? The advertising revenue model that we kind of hooked that to essentially made a vital democratic function beholden to and dependent upon capitalism, people being able to make money off of it, right? And the results have kind of spoken for themselves, right? When people are pissed off that we have so many goddamn advertisements in this country, well, there you go. That's what happens when you build a news industry upon this. When people get mad that mainstream media just keep interviewing like corporate lobbyists or like high-paid think tank assholes, people with an economic agenda to push. That's what happens when this is the model that you base your media on, right? When you base an entire news system on things like privileged access, right, and competition between firms, as it were, or newspapers or outposts, not a kind of collaborative information ecosystem that benefits the collective health of the demos. That's what you end up with, right? Is the kind of like hodgepodge, like Frankenstein's monster of a news system that we have in this country. And I think that the fact that, the people, as it were, are so disempowered in American democracy is not unrelated to that, right? I think it doesn't all depend on the fact that our news system is fucked, but, I think that plays a very essential role in it. And I think that part of where I'm leading to is that to get out of this, we have to kind of approach media in that sort of collaborative way. We have to invest in media and think about media and engage with media, not just consume it with a non-capitalist or an anti-capitalist kind of perspective. I think that is the only way that we can inevitably fulfill the original democratic promise of the free press. Right. But like to go back to your question, Gavin, I mentioned Robin John's book about the life and death of American journalism. Right. They reached the kind of conclusion that I would reach, which is that not only is the kind of corporate model, the advertising revenue based model, like a bankrupt model now, literally, but, it has kind of left us in a position where, in the 21st century, we are producing what we're producing, even though there's a lot of content, it still doesn't hold a candle to kind of like the heyday of, journalism, as it were, in like original investigative journalism or anything like that. That's been dying for a long time. What we've instead got is a lot of commentary and a lot of repackaging of the same information that gets shared around, and picked apart, picked clean. Everyone's referencing the same AP report, yada, yada, yada. So it's really just kind of putting as much chum out there to your respective audiences to make enough money to cover your overhead. Really, that's kind of the situation that we're in. And what Nichols and McChesney kind of say is that there's really only one way out of this, which is like New Deal level investment in kind of like public subsidies for all journalism. And they say like you can't get bogged down in the ideological debate, but like something like what the UK has or whatever, but like there's a massive amount of funding for journalism that just has never really existed in the United States. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't think it's ever going to happen. So then the question becomes, when we already start with this massive gap in kind of the funding structure for the news industry in this country, can crowdsourced projects through Patreon and Substack and what have you fill that gap? Or can nonprofits like The Real News fill that gap? I think, like, again, it's a yes and no question because a lot of it depends on how things are changing, right? I think that, even my own media career, if we're just looking like in the past 5 years, right? I've kind of already seen a lot of the kind of changes that have happened from the kind of, Trump's presidency and the kind of primaries before that were a massive boon to a dying news industry, right? And that was across the board, right? The mainstream media got these big bumps in ratings and subscriptions, but also the left, right? I mean, I ended up kind of really starting my media career as a columnist for The Baffler at a time when The Baffler, Jacobin, and Current Affairs probably wouldn't have survived if Trump wasn't elected. Or if they did, their path to where they are now would have been a lot more difficult. And so I'm constantly wrestling with the fact.
Do you think that Bernie's rise had anything to do with that too? Because it seems like he
do.
Excited the left and obviously the Jacobin, I think, gained a lot of readers from like the increased membership from the DSA, which could be also attributed to Bernie's campaign. But that's a really interesting observation, and I think that that's totally correct. That Trump kind of did save a lot of the these media companies as far as their ratings goes, and it'll be interesting to see how they try to fill that void now that he's gone or that he's exiting at least.
Oh, he's not gone. And I think that's the big takeaway from all this is the fact that Donald Trump is, and not to completely derail the conversation, but I think for certain he's going to continue to tease this 2024 run, and, at least until 2023 when he'll make up his mind. But he just loves being the center of attention too much. And, I think that's exactly how they will continue to keep their ratings high. MSNBC is going to continue, to wave the alarm or ring the alarm bell. The fascists might get back in here. Donald Trump is going to do anything. You can't criticize Joe Biden. You can't criticize Kamala Harris. You're just going to get Donald Trump back in here. Is that what you want? Whereas Fox News, they're in a bit of a pickle because they've been kind of outrighted by One American News Network. But I have a feeling that they're going to continue to kind of, do the whole Joe Biden's a socialist thing, and the alarmists, it's just going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, there are going to be residues and echoes of 2016 in the 2020s, for sure, in the vein that you just described. But there also are going to be, I think, a lot of changes, right? And we're already seeing it, right? We've already, from the moment that Biden was declared the victor, right? We have this kind of concerted push to get back to normal, right? To re-embrace the center, right? And to, now we're just hearing all these kind of same empty platitudes about national unity and yada, yada, yada. And what that is going to mean for us on the left and for media makers in general, right, is that, in fact, we should expect the pendulum to swing in the opposite way that it did in 2016. And the left needs to think very seriously about that because, we have grown. The left is still very paltry in the political kind of landscape today, but our presence has grown with the help of Bernie Sanders and AOC and the squad and stuff like that. But, in this kind of new era of the Biden presidency, there is going to kind of be a very forceful kind of push from the media on down to, like I said, get back to normal. And in one sense, it's very understandable, right? Because if you think about like the audiences, right? If you think about the people I guess, tie it all the way back to the original question that y'all asked me, right? About building solidarity and communicating with one another and connecting with one another. if we're going to do that, we have to understand that a lot of people out there are very justified in wanting to not have to think about politics every day.
Yeah.
Right. It has been an exhausting 4 years. Right. And it's not over. Right. I mean, the pandemic, I mean, and all the kind of issues that you raised earlier, right, about the struggles that working people are facing today. It's a lot. It's a lot. And we can't to browbeat people into thinking about something they don't want to think about. That doesn't mean we abandon the mission. It just means we have to, again, open our ears more and listen and find the soft points where people's political will and political consciousness is still alive, and where we can activate that without triggering their political fatigue. Right. I think that is where things like conversation and, with working people may be able to kind of fit into the left's overarching media strategy moving forward. I think that it also means that when we talk about politics, we need to be able to bring it down to eye level and to communicate the struggle through the things that people experience in their daily lives, and not just kind of the power brokers in DC or state legislatures or stuff like that. Right. There are a lot of ways that we have to kind of adjust to the waters that we're swimming in, right, and the people that we're trying to reach. And I think that where independent media is really poised to do that, right, is that, we're not taking the same model that mainstream media was, which is like, we command your attention through our monopolies on cable packages and cable and the channels, the select number of channels that are there, the select number of radio stations that are available in a certain area. Those dynamics have been changing for a long time. Now, everything is kind of communicated and distributed through this medium of the internet. That gives us an advantage, right? But it also means that the field is very cluttered. It means that, we have to, we're not just like talking down at people, right, from on high with our stranglehold on these cable packages and what have you. Right. Instead, we are able to reach people at a more kind of grassroots level and appeal to them based on what they are telling us their needs are. Right. And what we can kind of piece together by working together. Right. By connecting with other journalistic outposts, not just in the US, but internationally, podcasts in the US and internationally. We need to constantly be trying to think of this as a collective project that can not just kind of survive in today's media ecosystem, but that can eventually kind of overtake, this dying kind of infrastructure of corporate media. And the only way we're going to do that is together. Because to your point, Gavin, like, I think we can make, the field has changed enough that crowdsourced projects via Substack or Patreon are actually more viable now than they were even a couple of years ago, right? But we're not going to ever kind of build up a Patreon that gives us as robust of an infrastructure as the New York Times did 20 years ago. That's just not going to happen. And so the way that we do that, right, is through a kind of collaborative international network of media and political kind of organizations and personalities, something that is responsive to the people that we are trying to serve and the people we are trying to activate into kind of like the democratic struggle for a better world. And, the sad fact is that we live in a kind of media ecosystem that is constantly trying to get us to think like capitalists, to get us to think like competitors, to get us to lord over our own personal fiefdoms of followers and Patreon subscribers, and to always see it as a zero-sum game. It's not that. And we need to stop thinking about it that way. We need to have one another on our shows. We need to think differently about how we package our products and who has access to them and how we get it to people, right? How it's not just marketing, right? But it's actually collaborating in a way that gets people content that they may actually want and need, but they, because of today's algorithms, because of a million other factors, they may just not see it. So if we are commanding a small number of, viewers or listeners in the way that the big media companies used to command a mass audience, if we have smaller pieces of that, then we start putting them together, right? Gradual, bit by bit, right? Until like that catalyzes a process where they are passing it on, where they are starting their own media projects, where they are informing our projects. That's the only way I see a way out of this. I don't think there's going to be a dominant medium in the rest of the 20th century. I think the internet has kind of absorbed all other mediums into itself, text, radio, TV, and now it's kind of made that kind of accessible through all of the different kind of smartphones and computers that we have. And so I think that the more that we kind of get on this train and start approaching media this way now, instead of kind of waiting for some silver bullet that will like give us access to the mass audience that no longer exists, I think we'll have a real shot.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's, something that's so important too, to, talk about how a lot of times, especially leftist media, can be very just depressing and overwhelming to, an average normal working person who doesn't necessarily feel like they have it in their, mental capacity to, sit through 2 hours of the latest horror stories going around the world. And that's something, we try to do here at the Vanguard, is exactly that, kind of repackaging some of these ideas or, informational things into a forum where people actually will want to, enjoy it and watch it and share it. And I think you mentioned AOC too. I think that she's, kind of been a pioneer as far as making leftism, kind of cool, the squad going on Twitch streams and playing Among Us, stuff like that, it is a kind of a pathway into these real substantive conversations for maybe just your random millennial or Gen Z person out there who may not have an outlet for their frustrations with the world, that may not realize that there's a political or activist path for them to take where they can express some of the ways that they're feeling. So I think that's a really good point that you've made. And thanks so much for, sharing your perspective on that.
Yeah, Maximillian, we want to be respectful of your time. We really appreciate you coming to chat with us. I guess as just one final parting note, where can people go to, one, support you and check out the work you do on different platforms?
Yeah, thanks, guys. I really appreciate you having me on. Really appreciate the discussion. You can tell, like, just by my long-winded response to your questions, like this is something that I think about a lot, and I'm really, really excited when other people kind of are participating in that conversation and getting me involved in that conversation. Because again, I think we need to strategize in this arena as much as we need to in kind of other areas of organizing. Approaching media with an organizing mindset is not a bad thing. Media making is not organizing, but I think if you approach it with the same type of principles, you'll be surprised where you end up, and I think you'll be happy with where you end up. And I guess the last thing that I would say about the stakes here is that the stakes of approaching this collaboratively and not competitively is that, if we're thinking competitively, even the biggest left podcasts, even Jacobin, all of us pale in comparison to what the right has. Like, we are getting creamed, and it's not even close.
Yeah,
right?
Ted Cruz's podcast is so fucking popular, it's horrifying.
Yep. So, if we want to keep sniping at each other on Twitter, and being proud of ourselves for kind of having a certain number of listeners while Ted Cruz is whooping all of our asses, while Ben Shapiro is whooping all of our asses, then great, then good luck, right? So anyway, I don't say that to be disheartening. I say it to hopefully galvanize people to get going now and to stop thinking like capitalists about this. But where folks can find me, I'm on Twitter at Maximil_ALV, I believe. Working People is on iTunes, Spotify. We are partnered with In These Times magazine, a great magazine, so you can find us on there as well. Check us out if you want to listen to me interview workers. I promise I talk a lot less on those episodes. But on top of that, please go check out the Real News and all the kind of great shows that we have on offer, all the great hosts and personalities that we have. I can't even begin to kind of list all of them. But I mean, seriously, like anything that you are interested in, if you were like even just left curious, right? Or not left curious, I think there's a lot of stuff there for you, right? There's Eddie Conway, a massive towering figure on the left, former Black Panther here in Baltimore, who was a political prisoner, who now hosts a show called Rattling the Bars about prisons and prison abolition. Like, it's an incredible show that, you know, the left can really use. And I think that, you know, Eddie himself is a really brilliant, towering figure. Like, that's just one of the shows that we have. We have Police Accountability Report, where Taya Graham and Stephen Janis kind of report on what the police are doing. With the death of local journalism, we need programs like this to kind of shine a light on, you know, the corruption of the police around the country. Right. So there's a lot of great stuff at The Real News. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. Check out our website, check out our YouTube channels. And let's keep building this thing together.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
All that information, all those links are in the description box below for anyone that's watching. And I urge everyone that is watching to check out exactly as you said, Maximillian, those shows. They're great. And I'm actually going to check out that one that you mentioned. I haven't listened yet, but that sounds like an absolutely great show about the police reform and Rattling the Bars, I think you said it was called.
So there's Rattling the Bars, which is about prisons and prison abolition. Police Accountability Report, which is about kind of reporting on the police, and a lot of other great shows as well. Yeah, definitely check those out.
As well as a bunch of great interview collections. I know when I was, first exploring YouTube, you guys had some of my favorite interviews ever. I just have to plug that David Graeber interview from a few years back. Rest in peace to David Graeber, one of the premier anthropological thinkers of our time, anarchist thinkers. So anyway, just to plug that for the 1 millionth time on our podcast, because I talk about it a lot.
Yeah, thanks
awesome.
so much.
Thanks so much, guys.